The millionaire CEO thought he'd lost everything, until his ex walked into his office, with two little girls who looked just like him. The rain had stopped just as Emily stood in front of the tall glass doors of Reed Corporation, her reflection trembling in the glossy surface. Her heart was pounding so violently that she had to press her hand to her chest to steady it, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside her. She hadn't been in this building for more than 4 years, and yet everything about it still felt painfully familiar: the faint smell of polished marble, the distant hum of voices, the memory of his laughter echoing through those very halls. She had spent years convincing herself that she would never come back here, that she didn't need to. But life has a way of forcing confrontations we least want to face. In each of her hands was a tiny warm palm, two small figures standing beside her, both staring wide-eyed at the towering skyscraper that reached for the clouds. Lily and Sophia were only 4, but they were already so much like her, curious, cautious, and far too wise for their age. They didn't yet understand why their mother looked so pale, why her lips trembled every time she took a breath. All they knew was that she had told them they were going to meet someone very important today. Emily had practiced what she would say 100 times, whispering to herself in the quiet of the night when her daughters were asleep. She had imagined every reaction he might have: anger, disbelief, maybe even laughter. But no amount of preparation could change the fact that she was about to stand face to face with the man who had once held her heart and then broken it into 1,000 pieces. When she told him she was pregnant, Michael Reed had accused her of lying, of trying to manipulate him for his money. She had begged him to listen, had shown him the test, had cried until her throat burned, but he had simply looked at her with that cold, unreadable expression that had once made him such a brilliant businessman. Then he had walked away without a word. She remembered that night as if it had been carved into her bones: the echo of the door slamming behind him, the silence that followed, and the crushing realization that she was alone. She had packed her things and left the city within days, disappearing from his world completely. For years she had built a new life, working as a freelance designer, raising her daughters in a small coastal town where nobody knew her past. There had been sleepless nights, bills she didn't know how to pay, illnesses that made her want to collapse from exhaustion, but she had never regretted keeping her children. They were her everything, her reason for breathing, her proof that love could still exist even after betrayal. Yet as she stood now before the man who had once abandoned her, she felt that same suffocating fear she'd fought so hard to bury. What if he didn't care? What if he turned his back again? She wasn't here to ask for money or forgiveness. She was here because her daughters deserved to know who their father was. They had begun asking questions recently: why they didn't have a daddy, why their eyes were blue when hers were brown. And when Sophia had looked up one night and said, "Maybe he just got lost," Emily knew she couldn't keep pretending forever. The lobby doors slid open with a soft hiss, and a wave of cool air hit her face. The receptionist glanced up with a practiced smile that faltered slightly when she saw the two little girls holding their mother's hands. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. "I need to see Mr. Reed," she managed to say. The woman blinked, hesitating. "Do you have an appointment?" Emily shook her head. "Tell him it's Emily." The receptionist's expression shifted, recognition flickering in her eyes. She hesitated, then reached for the phone. Emily's stomach twisted as she watched her make the call. Minutes later, she was told to go up. The elevator ride felt endless. The mirrored walls reflected her anxiety, the small figures beside her whispering to each other about how high they were going. When the doors finally opened, she stepped out into a hallway she once knew too well. The scent of his cologne still lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the door to his office. There was a pause, then a deep voice said, "Come in." And there he was. Michael Reed. The man she had loved, the man who had broken her heart, the man who didn't know he had 2 daughters with eyes just like his. He looked up from his desk, confusion flickering across his face before turning into shock. His pen slipped from his hand. For a moment, no one spoke. The air between them felt heavy, electric, like something long buried had just been unearthed. Lily squeezed her mother's hand and whispered, "Mommy, is that him?" Emily's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Yes, baby. That's him." Michael didn't move for what felt like a full minute, his mind struggling to piece together what he was seeing. The air in the office had gone still, as though even the world outside the large panoramic windows had stopped breathing. He looked from Emily to the 2 little girls who stood quietly at her side, their tiny hands wrapped around her fingers, their matching blue eyes wide with innocent curiosity. It was impossible to ignore the familiar curve of their mouths, the soft wave of their hair, the very same shade of chestnut he saw in the mirror every morning. His throat tightened, and for the first time in years, words refused to come. Emily stood rooted to the spot, clutching her daughter's hands as if letting go would make her collapse. She hadn't imagined it would be this hard, hadn't prepared herself for the way his gaze could still cut through her, unraveling all the fragile strength she had built over the years. She wanted to say something calm, something composed, but all that came out was a shaky breath. "Hello, Michael." Her voice was quiet but steady enough to break the silence between them. His name on her lips brought back 1,000 memories, late nights in his penthouse, whispered promises that she now knew were lies, the way he used to look at her as though she was the only person who could calm the chaos of his mind. Now that same gaze was fixed on her, but it wasn't love she saw there, it was confusion, disbelief, and something dangerously close to fear. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "Emily," he said finally, and the sound of his voice was low, almost uncertain. "What are you doing here?" She swallowed hard. "I needed to see you." Her fingers tightened around the girl's hands. "We needed to see you." His eyes flickered to the children again, and his brow furrowed. "Who are they?" The question hit her like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had known he would ask, had told herself she was ready, but hearing it aloud felt crueler than she expected. She took a step closer, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might crack her ribs. "They're your daughters, Michael." He froze, his eyes narrowing, searching her face for any trace of deception. "That's not possible," he said finally, his voice sharper now, the defensive tone of a man who'd been blindsided and didn't want to admit it. "You're saying they're mine?" Emily met his gaze, forcing herself not to look away. "Yes. I told you 4 years ago that I was pregnant. You didn't believe me then, and you left." Michael's expression hardened, the color draining from his face. The memory of that night came rushing back to him, the argument, the accusations, her tears. He had been angry then, not because she was pregnant, but because he was terrified. He'd told himself she was lying, that it was easier to cut her out than to face the chaos that fatherhood would bring into his meticulously controlled world. He remembered the slam of the door, her voice calling his name as he walked away. Now that same voice trembled as she stood before him, no longer pleading, just stating facts. "I didn't come here for anything," she said quietly. "Not money, not help. I just thought you should know." Her calmness unsettled him even more than anger would have. He couldn't look away from the children. They were whispering something to each other now, too young to understand the tension but perceptive enough to feel it. One of them, Lily, he would learn later, tilted her head and smiled nervously at him, a small, shy smile that made something twist deep in his chest. He took a step forward before he even realized what he was doing, his eyes drawn to her. "What are your names?" he asked, his voice softening without his permission. "I'm Lily," she said, her voice clear and curious, and she pointed to her sister. "This is Sophia." Emily watched him closely, waiting for the moment he would turn cold again, the way he always did when emotions threatened to surface. But instead, he crouched down slightly, meeting the girls at eye level. For a moment, he saw himself reflected in their eyes, his own shade of blue staring back at him. The realization sent a chill through him. He straightened abruptly and turned away, walking to the window as though the city skyline could somehow steady him. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, haunted. "Why now?" he asked without turning around. "Why after all this time?" "Because they started asking about you," Emily said simply. "And because I'm tired of hiding the truth." He stayed silent for a long time, his shoulders tense, his jaw clenched. Finally, he turned to face her again. "Do you want me to take a test?" She shook her head slowly. "You can, if you need to. But look at them, Michael. You already know." Her words hung in the air, heavy and certain. He looked at the girls again, really looked this time, and the denial that had always come so easily to him began to crumble. He saw it, the resemblance, the quiet innocence, the undeniable truth written across their faces. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "I need time," he said finally, his voice raw. "I can't process this right now." Emily nodded, though her chest ached. "I understand. I didn't expect you to." She turned to the girls and whispered softly, "Come on, sweethearts." They waved goodbye without fully understanding, their small voices chiming, "Bye, Mr." And as they walked out of his office, Michael stood frozen, watching them go, his heart caught somewhere between disbelief and an ache he didn't yet know how to name. When the door closed, the silence that filled the room was deafening. He leaned back against the window and exhaled shakily, his reflection staring back at him with unfamiliar eyes, eyes that now looked exactly like theirs. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. His penthouse apartment, usually a place of comfort and order, felt suffocating. The quiet hum of the city below only amplified the chaos in his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, two little girls with soft brown hair and piercing blue eyes, their small hands gripping Emily's as they stood in his office. He replayed every detail over and over, the way Lily had smiled shyly at him, the cautious way Emily had spoken, the calm certainty in her voice when she said, "You already know." And she was right. He did know. No test, no DNA result could undo what his heart had already accepted. Those girls were his. The realization struck him in waves, leaving behind a strange mix of awe, regret, and something he hadn't felt in years, fear. Not the fear of losing a deal or failing a client, but the fear of confronting what he had done, what he had missed, and the kind of man he had become because of it. He poured himself a drink, though he barely touched it. The whiskey burned his throat, but it didn't numb the ache. He walked through the apartment, stopping by the window that overlooked the city, its lights glittering like distant stars. Somewhere down there, Emily was probably tucking the girls into bed, maybe reading them a story, maybe kissing their foreheads goodnight. He tried to imagine it, the sound of their laughter, the chaos of bedtime, the simple domestic warmth that had never existed in his life. For years, everything had revolved around his empire, his company, his success. He had built walls around himself so high that even the thought of family felt like a weakness. And yet, standing there now, he realized he'd traded love for control, and in doing so, he'd lost something far more valuable than any deal he'd ever made. The next morning, he walked into the office earlier than usual. His assistant greeted him nervously, everyone could sense when he wasn't in his usual composed state. He didn't respond, just nodded and closed the door behind him. The documents on his desk blurred before his eyes. He couldn't focus on numbers, contracts, or profit margins. His mind kept drifting back to Emily's expression. It wasn't anger he saw in her face, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of carrying everything alone. He remembered how fiercely independent she had always been, how she used to tease him about his obsession with work. One day, she had said once, "You'll realize that love isn't something you can schedule or sign a contract for." He had laughed at her then, certain that emotions only got in the way of ambition. But now, he would have given anything to go back and listen. By midday, he gave up pretending to work. He grabbed his coat and left the building, ignoring the questioning looks of his employees. He didn't have a plan, he just drove. The city stretched endlessly before him, but somehow, without even thinking, he found himself outside Emily's neighborhood. He parked across the street from a small apartment building that looked modest but well kept, the kind of place that spoke of quiet resilience. He sat there for a long time, watching the rain start to fall again, blurring his view of the front door. And then he saw them. Emily stepped outside with the girls, both bundled in matching raincoats, their tiny boots splashing through puddles as they laughed. The sound carried even through the closed car window, pure and light, cutting through the heaviness inside him. He couldn't look away. Emily bent down to fix Sophia's hood, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face with such tenderness that his chest tightened. It wasn't just that she was a good mother, it was that she had done it all without him. Every scraped knee, every fever, every sleepless night, she had been there, and he hadn't. Lily spotted a puddle and jumped straight into it, splashing water everywhere. Emily laughed, the sound soft and real, and in that moment, Michael felt something break inside him. It wasn't guilt anymore, it was longing. Longing for what could have been, for what might still be if he had the courage to reach for it. But he didn't get out of the car. He couldn't. He wasn't ready to face her again, not when he still didn't know what to say. He stayed there until they disappeared around the corner, heading toward a small cafe down the street. Only then did he start the engine and drive away, his chest heavy but his mind clearer than it had been in years. That night, he sat at his desk at home and opened a blank document. He began to write, not a business plan, not a statement or report, but a letter. The first words came slowly, his hands trembling as he typed. Emily, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know what I did, and I know what I lost because of it. I can't change the past, but I need to be part of their future, even if it's only from the sidelines. Please, let me try. He stared at the words for a long time, unsure if he would ever have the courage to send them. But for the first time in years, he felt something close to hope. And that was enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't impossible. Emily hadn't expected to see him again so soon. When the knock came at her door that Saturday morning, she was still in her robe, her hair tied in a loose bun, the twins sitting at the table behind her eating pancakes shaped like hearts. For a brief moment, she thought it might be a neighbor or a package delivery, but when she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Michael stood there. The same man who had once walked out on her now stood on her doorstep, his blue eyes searching her face as if trying to read years' worth of emotions he had once refused to see. He looked different, not in the tailored suit he usually wore, but in a simple dark sweater and jeans. There was something in his posture, something uncertain, almost hesitant, that she had never seen before. The powerful CEO seemed, for the first time, unsure of himself. "Hi," he said quietly, his voice low, almost cautious. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of 4 lost years. Emily didn't answer at first. Her hand tightened on the edge of the door, torn between slamming it shut and letting him in. The girls had gone silent behind her, their giggles fading as they watched the strange man who had appeared in their doorway. Michael's eyes flickered toward them, and something raw crossed his face. They were sitting side by side, still in their pajamas, syrup on their fingers, identical blue eyes staring at him with a mix of curiosity and confusion. "Can I come in?" he asked finally. Emily hesitated, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She wanted to say no, to protect herself, to keep the fragile peace she'd built, but something in his tone stopped her. There was no arrogance, no anger, no cold dismissal. Just quiet sincerity. She stepped aside wordlessly, and he entered, his gaze taking in the small, cozy apartment, the scattered toys, the half-drawn pictures on the fridge, the signs of a life he hadn't been there to witness. He looked like he didn't know where to stand, so he stayed near the doorway, his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. "Girls," Emily said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "this is Michael. He's an old friend." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth yet. The twins glanced at each other, then back at him. Lily spoke first, her tone polite but curious. "Hi." Sophia waved shyly before hiding behind her sister's shoulder. Michael's lips curved in a faint, unsteady smile. "Hi, girls," he said softly, and the warmth in his voice took Emily off guard. He looked at them as if he couldn't believe they were real. For a few moments, silence hung between the adults, filled only by the sound of the girls whispering to each other. Emily busied herself with cleaning the table, her movements brisk and controlled. "Why are you here, Michael?" she finally asked, not turning around. He took a deep breath. "Because I needed to see you. And them." She froze mid-motion, her hand gripping the dishcloth tightly. "You already did," she said quietly. "At your office." He stepped closer. "Not like that." "I was shocked, Emily. I didn't know what to say. I still don't. But I couldn't stop thinking about you, about them." She turned then, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, the years fell away. The pain, the betrayal, the distance, they were all still there, but so was something else. The memory of what they once had. "You don't get to just walk in here and act like nothing happened," she said, her voice shaking. "You made your choice, Michael. You left." He nodded slowly, guilt flickering in his eyes. "I know. And I've regretted it every day since." He moved a little closer, lowering his voice. "I was scared, Emily. Of what it meant, of what I'd have to give up. I thought I could live without you, without them. I was wrong." The honesty in his tone disarmed her. This wasn't the man who had shouted and accused, who had turned his back the moment things became difficult. This was someone else, someone stripped of pride and certainty, someone trying, clumsily, to make amends. Emily wanted to hate him, but she couldn't ignore the sincerity in his eyes. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. He shook his head. "Nothing. I just want to know them. Even if you never forgive me." The sound of little feet interrupted them. Lily had climbed down from her chair and was holding something, a crayon drawing she had made earlier that morning. She walked over to Michael and held it out. "This is me and Mommy," she said proudly. "We made pancakes." He crouched down to her level, his throat tightening as he looked at the uneven lines, the smiling stick figures holding hands. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice thick. "You're a great artist." Lily grinned and looked back at her mother. "Mommy, can he come next time we make pancakes?" The question hit Emily like a knife and a bomb all at once. She felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away before the girls could see. "Maybe," she said softly. Michael stood slowly, his gaze meeting hers again. "I'll leave," he said after a moment, his voice rough. "I didn't mean to intrude. I just, needed to see you. Needed to see them. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He turned toward the door, pausing for a second before looking back. "They're perfect, Emily," he said quietly. "You did everything right." After he left, the apartment felt unbearably silent. Emily stood by the window, watching him walk away, the rain beginning to fall again. The girls had gone back to their pancakes, giggling softly, unaware of the storm that had just passed through their lives. Emily pressed a hand to her chest, her heart aching with confusion. She had built her world on the ruins he left behind, and now, with one unexpected visit, he had shaken it all apart again. But beneath the fear and anger, a tiny spark of something dangerous flickered to life: hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of emotions that neither Emily nor Michael could fully understand. After his unexpected visit, Michael couldn't get the image of the twins out of his mind. Every day at the office felt emptier, every meeting a hollow performance. He found himself distracted during presentations, his focus breaking every time he saw the faint reflection of his own eyes in the conference room glass. They were the same blue eyes that looked back at him from Lily and Sophia's faces. For years, he had built his world around control, precision, and logic, but now logic had abandoned him. He had 2 daughters, 2 living, breathing pieces of himself, and he had missed everything. Their first words, their first steps, their birthdays. The realization haunted him in a way no failure ever had. He began driving past their neighborhood after work, parking discreetly across the street, just to catch a glimpse of them. He watched from a distance as Emily walked them to preschool in the mornings, her hand holding both of theirs as they skipped ahead, their laughter echoing down the quiet street. He watched them chase butterflies in the park, feed ducks near the pond, and once, he saw Lily fall and scrape her knee. His entire body tensed as if he were the one who had fallen, but before he could react, Emily knelt, kissed the little wound, and wiped away the tears with such gentle care that he could hardly breathe. That sight filled him with both awe and regret. She had been mother and father, strength and comfort, everything his daughters had needed, and she had done it all without him. One evening, unable to bear the distance any longer, he decided to reach out properly. He didn't want to just show up again and throw her life into chaos. Instead, he wrote a letter, his second attempt after the one he had never sent weeks earlier. He kept it simple, honest, stripped of excuses. Emily, I don't expect to be forgiven. I don't deserve to be. But I would like to know them, even just a little. I don't want to take anything from you. I just want to be part of their lives, however you'll allow. He stared at the words for a long time before slipping the letter into an envelope and leaving it in her mailbox late one evening when the lights in her apartment were already off. Emily found it the next morning on her way out with the girls. She stood in the doorway, her hands trembling as she read his words. She had expected anger, guilt, maybe self-pity, but what she found instead was sincerity. It terrified her more than his arrogance ever had. She folded the letter slowly and tucked it into her purse, unable to decide what to do. All day at work, her thoughts kept drifting back to him. He had always been a force of nature, powerful, relentless, impossible to ignore, but now she saw a man stripped of all that, and it made her heart ache in ways she didn't want to admit. That weekend, as she watched the girls play in the living room, Emily made her decision. She dialed his number for the first time in years. The moment she heard his voice on the other end, all the words she had planned vanished. "You can see them," she said simply, her tone firm but cautious. There was a pause, then a quiet breath of disbelief. "Thank you," he said softly. "Just don't make me regret it," she replied, and ended the call. They met at the park the next afternoon. The air was warm and bright, filled with the laughter of children and the scent of blooming flowers. Michael arrived early, wearing a casual shirt and jeans again. He wanted to seem approachable, though his nerves betrayed him. When Emily arrived with the girls, they froze for a moment at the sight of him sitting on a bench, holding two small teddy bears he had bought on impulse that morning. The twins approached cautiously, clinging to their mother's hands. "Hi," he said, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound calm. "Hi," Lily echoed, her eyes flicking to the toys. He smiled gently and held them out. "I thought maybe you two could use some new friends." They hesitated before taking them, and when Sophia hugged hers tightly, something in his chest eased for the first time in years. Emily stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the exchange carefully. The afternoon unfolded with a surprising ease. The girls were shy at first, but it didn't take long for curiosity to win. They asked him about his car, his watch, and whether he knew how to make pancakes. When he told them no, Lily giggled and said, "Then Mommy can teach you." Emily rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling at their innocent boldness. Michael sat with them on the grass, helping them build a tiny castle out of sticks and flowers, his expensive watch glinting in the sunlight as he worked with clumsy fingers. At one point, Sophia looked up and asked, "Do you have kids too?" The question hit him like a punch. He swallowed hard and shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Just you." She tilted her head, confused but satisfied, then went back to arranging her flowers. Emily's breath caught, her throat tightening as she turned away, pretending to watch the ducks. She hadn't planned for this moment to be so emotional, hadn't expected him to look so human. As the sun began to set, Emily called the girls over. "Say goodbye, sweethearts. It's time to go." They hugged him quickly, both murmuring a shy "Bye, Michael," before running ahead toward the car. He watched them go, his chest tight, his hands trembling. Emily lingered for a moment, turning back to face him. "They like you," she said quietly. "But don't make promises you can't keep. They've never been disappointed before. I won't let you be the first." He nodded, his voice low. "I won't. I swear." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing whether to believe him. Then she simply said, "We'll see," and walked away. He stood there until they disappeared from sight, the fading laughter of his daughters echoing in the distance. For the first time in his life, he realized that success wasn't closing deals or signing contracts. It was earning the right to hear those small voices call him something he'd never been before, a father. The days that followed were both the most fragile and the most hopeful of Michael's life. After that first meeting at the park, Emily agreed, hesitantly, to let him see the girls once a week. She was cautious, constantly watching for any sign that he would disappear again, but he didn't. For the first time in years, he began to rearrange his schedule, canceling late meetings, leaving the office before sunset, and telling his assistant not to disturb him on certain afternoons. His colleagues were stunned. The man who once measured time in profits was now measuring it in hours spent on a playground. Every Friday, he met Emily and the twins at the park, each visit a new layer of discovery. The girls were endlessly curious. They asked him about everything, from why the sky was blue to why his watch ticked so loudly. He found himself answering with patience he hadn't known he possessed. They laughed when he tried to braid their hair and failed miserably, and he learned that Lily loved drawing while Sophia preferred climbing trees. The more time he spent with them, the more their differences and personalities shone through, and he realized that they weren't just pieces of him, they were their own little worlds. Emily watched these meetings with a mixture of pride and unease. She couldn't deny that he was trying. There was no arrogance in him anymore, no sense of entitlement. He listened to the girls, paid attention to what made them happy, and treated them with tenderness she had never seen from him before. But still, every time he smiled at them, she felt a pang of fear. He had broken her once so completely that trusting him again felt dangerous, like standing near the edge of a cliff and pretending not to look down. She had built her life around protecting the twins, from pain, from disappointment, from the ghosts of the past, and now, the man who was once her greatest heartbreak was gently threading his way back into their lives. One evening, after one of their visits, Michael offered to walk them home. The girls skipped ahead, chasing fireflies along the sidewalk while Emily and Michael followed behind. The air was warm, the sun melting into the horizon, painting the world in gold. For a while, they walked in silence, the sound of laughter filling the space between them. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice low. "They like you," she said. "More than I expected." He smiled faintly. "I like them more than I thought I could like anyone." She glanced at him, her expression softening for a moment before hardening again. "Don't say things like that unless you mean them." He stopped walking. "I mean every word." There was something in his tone that made her heart skip. She looked away quickly, focusing on the girls up ahead, but the truth of his words lingered. That night, after putting the twins to bed, Emily sat by the window, thinking about the way he had looked at them, at her. She hated how easily old memories resurfaced, the nights they had stayed up talking until dawn, the way he used to laugh when she teased him, the way he once whispered her name like it meant something sacred. But those memories were tangled with the pain of betrayal, the sound of his voice saying things that had cut her open. She couldn't let herself forget that. And yet, a small part of her couldn't deny the way her heart had softened around him again, piece by piece. For Michael, every visit was both a joy and a torment. The more time he spent with them, the more he realized how much he had missed. One afternoon, while helping Lily build a sandcastle, she asked him out of nowhere, "Why don't you live with us?" The question hit him so hard that he almost dropped the tiny bucket in his hands. Emily, who had been reading nearby, froze. He swallowed hard before answering carefully. "Because I don't think your mommy would like that," he said with a small smile. Lily frowned. "But we do." Sophia nodded in agreement. "You make mommy smile." Emily's cheeks flushed as she looked down at her book, pretending not to hear. Later, as they packed up to leave, Michael lingered by the car. "They're amazing," he said quietly. "You've done an incredible job, Emily." She met his eyes, her voice steady but soft. "I had no choice." He hesitated before speaking again. "You did. You could have given up, or walked away. But you didn't. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. For years, she had fought to be strong because she had to be, not because anyone had seen her strength. Hearing him acknowledge it now was both healing and painful. A few days later, Michael invited them to his company's charity event, a family-friendly evening at a park filled with games, food, and music. Emily hesitated, but the twins were excited, and against her better judgment, she agreed. When they arrived, she saw the stunned faces of his colleagues as he walked in not with a model or a business partner, but with a woman and two little girls holding his hands. He didn't care about the whispers or the curious stares. For the first time, he felt proud, proud to stand beside them, proud to show the world what mattered most to him. That evening was filled with laughter and light. The girls painted their faces, danced under the string lights, and dragged him to every game booth. Emily stood watching from the sidelines, her heart caught between disbelief and quiet joy. At one point, Michael caught her eye from across the field, and their gaze held longer than it should have. For a fleeting second, the noise and chaos around them disappeared, leaving only that familiar pull between them, one that had never really gone away. When the night ended, and the girls had fallen asleep in the back seat, Emily turned to him. "They had a good time," she said softly. "So did I," he smiled faintly, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I'm glad." Then, after a pause, he added, "I don't want this to end, Emily. I don't want to keep pretending we're just two people who share a past. We share a future too, whether you want to admit it or not." Her breath caught, and she turned to look out the window, unsure how to answer. The city lights blurred past, and in that moment, she realized she was standing at the edge of something dangerous again, something she might not survive if it went wrong. But deep down, despite every warning her mind screamed, her heart whispered something different. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. The next morning brought a calm Emily hadn't felt in years, yet underneath it, there was a tension that wouldn't leave her alone. The charity event had stirred something in her, something she had tried to bury beneath years of bitterness and quiet strength. Watching Michael with the girls had been almost unbearable. He had laughed with them, chased them across the grass, carried them on his shoulders as if he had always been there. There had been no trace of the cold, detached man she once knew, and that frightened her more than the memory of his cruelty ever had. Because now, he wasn't the villain in her story anymore. He was becoming human again, too human, too real, too close to what her heart still wanted. She spent most of that day pretending everything was normal. She cooked breakfast, read the twins their favorite story, and took them to the park, all while fighting the ache in her chest. Every time she saw their smiles, she saw pieces of him. Every time they said something clever or stubborn, she heard echoes of his voice. She couldn't escape him, not even in the smallest details of their lives. Michael, meanwhile, couldn't stop replaying the night in his mind. He hadn't meant to say what he said in the car, that they had a future, but once the words left his mouth, he couldn't take them back. He had seen something in Emily's eyes before she turned away, something that made him believe she felt it too. For the first time, hope didn't feel foolish. It felt possible. He wanted to prove to her that he had changed, not just through words but through actions. Over the next few days, he called every evening to check on the girls, never pushing the conversation too far, never overstepping. When Emily answered, their talks were brief but filled with a quiet, careful warmth. She no longer hung up coldly, and sometimes, she even laughed at something he said. He cherished those small victories more than any deal he had ever closed. One Friday afternoon, he asked if he could pick the girls up from school. Emily hesitated for a long moment before agreeing, with strict instructions about their routines. He arrived early, sitting in his car nervously as children poured out of the building in a wave of laughter and backpacks. When the twins spotted him, their faces lit up, and they ran straight into his arms, shouting his name. For a man who once measured success in numbers, that moment redefined everything. He felt something break open inside him, a tenderness that had nothing to do with control or power. They walked together to the car, and on the way home, Lily chattered nonstop about a drawing she made, while Sophia hummed softly in the back seat. When he glanced at them in the rearview mirror, their reflections felt like sunlight breaking through a storm he thought would never end. When they got home, Emily was waiting at the door. The sight of them together, his hand resting protectively on Lily's shoulder, Sophia clinging to his sleeve, made her heart twist. They were perfect, he said softly, handing her the girls' backpacks. She smiled despite herself. Of course they were. He lingered for a moment before asking, "Can I stay for dinner?" The question hung in the air between them. The girls immediately began to cheer, begging her to say yes. She hesitated, torn between instinct and emotion, before finally nodding. "Fine. But you're helping." That evening was something out of another life. Michael helped set the table, clumsily following Emily's directions while the girls danced around the kitchen. They cooked together, pasta and garlic bread, simple but warm, and for the first time in years, laughter filled the house without tension hiding underneath it. After dinner, the twins put on a small show, singing a silly song they'd learned at school while Michael clapped and cheered like the proudest father alive. When it was time for bed, he read them a story, his deep voice softening as their eyelids began to flutter shut. Emily stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold with tears in her eyes. The sight was almost too much to bear. For years, she had carried everything alone, never allowing herself to imagine what it might be like to have someone share it with her. And now, seeing him there, whispering goodnight to their daughters, she felt something inside her begin to shift. When he came back into the living room, she handed him a cup of tea. Neither of them spoke for a while. The air was thick with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "I missed so much," he said quietly. "And I know I don't deserve a second chance. But I want to be here, Emily. For them. For you, if you'll let me." She stared down at her cup, tracing the rim with her finger. "You left me when I needed you most," she said, her voice trembling but calm. "You made me feel like I was nothing." He nodded slowly, his expression pained. "I know. I was a coward. I thought I could erase what scared me by pretending it didn't exist. But I've been paying for that every single day." She looked up then, meeting his eyes. "You don't get to fix everything with words, Michael. You can't just walk in and expect me to trust you again." He stepped closer, his tone soft but firm. "Then let me earn it. Let me show you, not say it." She wanted to believe him, God, she wanted to, but her heart still bore scars too deep to ignore. "You can't just erase the past," she whispered. "I don't want to," he replied. "I just want a future that doesn't repeat it." The sincerity in his voice made her chest ache. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock and the soft breathing of the girls in the next room. Then, almost without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. It was a small gesture, hesitant and trembling, but it was enough to make his eyes close in relief. They stayed like that for a while, two people standing in the ruins of their past, unsure of what the future would bring but finally willing to face it together. That night, after he left, Emily sat on the couch long after the lights went out. She could still feel the warmth of his hand against hers, the steadiness of his voice when he spoke about change. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him completely, but for the first time, forgiveness didn't feel impossible. Outside, the night was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes before something begins, not an ending, but a fragile new start waiting to unfold. Weeks passed, and what began as fragile attempts to coexist slowly turned into something neither of them had expected. Michael started coming by more often, not just for visits, but to help. He took the girls to school, attended parent meetings with Emily, and even fixed the leaky faucet in her kitchen one Saturday afternoon. It was strange, seeing him kneeling on the floor in a t-shirt and jeans, sleeves rolled up, completely out of place and yet fitting there as if he always had. The girls adored him, and their laughter filled the house in a way that softened everything hard and cold that had ever lived in those walls. Emily found herself watching him sometimes when he didn't notice, trying to reconcile this version of him with the man who had once broken her heart so completely. She didn't trust easily, but it was becoming harder to deny what she saw in front of her. This wasn't a performance. This was real. He had changed, not just because of guilt, but because he wanted to. Michael could hardly recognize his own life anymore, and for once, he didn't want to. The office that used to feel like his empire now felt empty without the sound of two small voices calling his name. His colleagues noticed the change, the softness in his expression, the way he smiled more often, the fact that he left work on time instead of drowning himself in deals and late-night negotiations. For years, he had believed success was measured in power and money. Now, he understood that all of it meant nothing if there was no one to share it with. He had spent so long trying to build an empire that he had forgotten to build a home. And now, for the first time, he had found one. But rebuilding trust wasn't simple. Emily still carried her doubts like invisible scars. One evening, after dinner, when the girls had gone to bed, she sat across from him at the kitchen table. The air between them was quiet but heavy. "Why now, Michael?" she asked suddenly. "Why did it take losing everything for you to realize what you wanted?" He hesitated, staring into his cup for a long time before answering. "Because I was afraid," he said softly. "Afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of losing control. You and the girls, you made me feel something that I couldn't control, and I ran from it. But running from it hurt more than anything else ever could." She studied him in silence, her heart torn between understanding and anger. "You can't expect me to just forget," she whispered. "I don't," he said, meeting her eyes. "I just want to give you new memories, better ones. Ones that make the old ones fade." The way he said it, quiet, sincere, almost pleading, made her chest tighten. She wanted to believe him, and maybe a small part of her already did. But believing meant risking everything again, and she didn't know if her heart could survive losing him twice. Yet the truth was, every time he showed up for the girls, every time he looked at her like she was the only person in the room, the wall she had built around herself began to crack. One rainy afternoon, Emily fell ill. It was nothing serious, but exhaustion and stress had caught up with her. When Michael came by to pick up the twins and found her pale and trembling, he didn't hesitate. He took charge as if it were the most natural thing in the world, making soup, keeping the girls entertained, tidying up the house. She tried to protest, but he silenced her gently. "You've done this alone for too long," he said quietly. "Let me help." That night, after putting the twins to bed, he sat beside her on the couch, her head resting against his shoulder. The rain tapped softly against the windows, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to rest, to let someone else hold the weight for her. The following morning, when she woke, the smell of coffee filled the air, and she found the girls giggling in the kitchen while Michael tried, unsuccessfully, to make pancakes. He looked up, smiling sheepishly. "I might have burned a few," he admitted. The sight made her laugh, a real, unguarded laugh, and in that moment, something shifted between them, something quiet but undeniable. He looked at her the way he used to before everything had gone wrong, and she didn't look away. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of their lives began to merge naturally. It wasn't perfect, there were arguments, awkward moments, old wounds reopening, but there was also forgiveness in places she never thought she'd find it. The girls started calling him Dad without hesitation one afternoon, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The word nearly brought him to his knees. He hugged them both tightly, his throat burning with emotion he couldn't speak. Emily stood watching, tears in her eyes, realizing that maybe some endings were meant to lead back to beginnings after all. One evening, months later, Michael invited them all on a weekend trip to the coast. He wanted to show them the ocean, to give the twins something beautiful to remember. They stood together on the beach, the wind tangling Emily's hair as the girls ran barefoot through the sand. Michael watched them for a long time before turning to her. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think my biggest achievement was what I built. The company, the deals, the empire. But standing here, I realize none of it means anything without this. Without you." She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with tears she didn't try to hide. "You broke me once," she whispered. "I know," he said. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving I can heal what I broke." He reached out slowly, brushing his fingers against hers, and this time, she didn't pull away. The waves crashed against the shore, the girls' laughter echoing through the salt-filled air, and for the first time in years, everything felt right. They stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky painted in gold and rose, and Emily realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The past had hurt them both, but it had also led them here, to this moment, to this love rebuilt from ruin, stronger than before. When the girls came running back, sand clinging to their feet and hair wild from the wind, Michael lifted them both into his arms. Emily watched them, her heart full, and when he looked at her over their shoulders, there was no distance left between them, no doubt, no fear, just the quiet, steady truth of what they had become. A family. Not perfect, not unscarred, but whole. And as the last light faded, she smiled, knowing that some stories don't end with loss, they end where they were always meant to begin.